Well, welcome everybody to our weekly ongoing coaching call. So glad that you're joining us today. We've been in a series on movement servants, talking about what that is and how we can be a part of movements by not just trying to catalyze them ourselves, but also by serving movements. And many of you guys will remember the statistic that we've been mentioning this entire series that I'm wanting it to be totally ingrained in your mind so that you don't forget it and you're always thinking about it. And that is that 90% of movements now are started by other movements. That has implications for us as well. 90% of movements are started by other movements. And so we're talking about how to serve some of those other movements that are starting 90% of the movements so that we can be a part of movements, whether we end up catalyzing movements or not. And hopefully we'll get to do both. So we've been in the series for 2 weeks now. This week, I wanted to bring in like a real life movement servant. As I was talking to Stan and we were thinking about a movement servant that would be great to have come and share with us. We both thought of Ken Morris, who's here today. And I'm so excited for you to meet him. I've known Ken for a while. I'm sure he'll tell more of the story, but he came through an eLife training in the early days and he's part of a church. And now he's a movement servant with a multiplying movement in East Africa, although he lives in the US. Now, you guys will have to help me thank Ken in a minute because Ken is in Africa now, even though he doesn't live there. And so it's like 11 o'clock at night his time. And I said, Ken, like Stan, you can pre-record if you want to. He said, I want to be there live to take questions. So Ken is here live from Nairobi, Africa. He's the US Director of Lifeway Global, which is a family of movements that Isla Tassi is a part of and helped to catalyze. Some of y'all know that name. He's got a new book coming out. So you've seen us talking about that some in Slack called Cabbages in the Desert. And his story is also documented in The Kingdom Unleashed, if you've read that book, and possibly some of the other popular movement books. So I wanted Ken to come and share with us just his journey to becoming a movement servant, because he was on a church staff and now he's US Director for Lifeway Global. So I want him to tell us about that. If you have questions for him, put them in the chat. And once he shares with us for 20 or 30 minutes, we'll take some of those questions. I know he'll be glad to answer them. So Ken, we're so glad you came today, and thanks for staying up late and hanging out with us.
Sure. No, my pleasure. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me to be a part of this. It's just exciting to see what God's been doing in the world over the last 30 years or so, the new wineskins he's creating through movements, and around that, a lot of new roles and identities that he's calling us to. So no, it's a joy for me to be here with you guys. I know some of you, we've connected in the past. Let me share my screen, and Chris, let me say this: my Wi-Fi signal shows it's real strong, but if it starts breaking up, I can turn my video off, and that might help my audio be stronger. So just let me know if I need to do that. So we'll start with the definition. Stan gave you this last week, and I'm just reprising it. Actually, Stan is here. I told Chris earlier I had dinner with him this evening. So here, a movement servant will come alongside movement leaders to help expand the movement or movements, assisting with a very wide range of ministry activities, depending on the ministry needs and the instructions of the movement leaders. So there you go. There's the classic definition per Stan Parks. So there we go. I want to just start with my story because as I look back on it, God's been preparing me for this role practically my whole life. And so as some of you begin to pray and consider, well, is this a role for me? There'll be a lot of clues in your own story. So right out of seminary, I went to Chicago as a church planter, planning to only be there for 2 years and then go overseas, and met my wife there, which delayed some of that. And then we had our first child who had major medical issues, was on a respirator for 3 years. And so it was death of a vision, and we thought going overseas would just never happen. And after 15 years in Chicago, we moved to Franklin, Tennessee, and I was on staff at a church at that point was called the People's Church, and went on a mission trip to Kosovo, and God broke my heart for those people and said, you didn't hear me wrong, you just didn't have the timing right. And God called us to Kosovo. And our family moved over there. And before we moved over there, we went through missionary orientation for 2 months. And David Garrison was the global strategist for the IMB at that time. And so our textbook for our missionary orientation for 2 months was church planting movements. And so when we went to Kosovo, we were using that as our textbook. We were praying, serving, looking for people of peace, doing discovery Bible studies. And after 4 years, we had some other medical issues come up and had to come back to the States. And that kind of crushed us and traumatized us in a way. So the People's Church invited me back, and was the mission pastor there through 2020. But it was during that time that God began rekindling just a heart for the world, and bringing me up to speed on what had been happening since early 2000s and hearing about disciple making movements. Some of you may know of Roy Moran. It was one of the books I picked up, Spent Matches, and thought, could this be the same guy that I was in Greek class at Baylor with? And sure enough, it was, and contacted Roy, explained that I was heavily involved in a partnership in Malawi. And he said that, well, if you're interested in movements in East Africa, Dr. Ila Tassi is the guy you got to connect with. And Roy got us, my friend in Malawi, his name's Christian Chepe. At that time, he was the principal of a school and that we were partnering with. And we came to Catalyst Camp in 2018. And it was at Catalyst Camp, Stan Parks was there, and I knew of Stan. And right before we went to Catalyst Camp, God began to just speak to me and say, get ready. I'm about to release you from your role there at what was then called Church of the City. They changed their name. They're now called Church of the City in Franklin. And so I went there kind of a bit off balance and thinking, well, God, is there something here maybe that you want to speak to me about? And when I saw Stan, I thought, well, I know Stan, I'm going to just talk to him. And I said, hey, I'm an old guy, and could Beyond, or do you see the need for someone like me in missions? And he said, oh yeah. And we started talking, and as we did, he said, I'm gonna talk to Isla and see, set up a meeting for you to talk with him, because Dr. Isla and I have had some conversations, and they're looking for some help with some training and some other needs. So I had a meeting with Dr. Isla, and just went home just kind of in a daze thinking, what's going on here? And heard about Chris Galanos, and that he was doing online training. And so called up Chris and said, hey, I've got some staff in the church and some other folks who are interested in disciple making movements. Could we be a part of one of your trainings? And so Chris graciously did a training for me and I think about 17 other people, mainly staff in our church. And I continued to contact my friend in Malawi, and within a month or two, he said, Ken, I've been using these disciple making movement principles, and things are going so fast. I don't know what to do. I'm seeing all kinds of people coming to the Lord, and DBS is multiplying. And so I called Isla and flew over to Malawi. Isla flew down and began to coach and mentor Christian, and sent staff later on. And so when Isla came to the States, he came through Tennessee. We visited on several occasions. And in the fall of 2019, in one of our conversations, he said, Ken, I've been praying for about 4 years now for someone in the US to represent Lifeway. And he said, in this last year, as I've gotten to know you and know that you were a church planter in downtown Chicago, you were a cross-cultural missionary in Kosovo, you were a missions pastor in a megachurch, and now God's called you into a disciple-making movement in Malawi. And he said, that's what we do at Lifeway. We catalyze movements. And I think you're the guy. Would you consider representing us in the US? And so I took about 2 seconds to pray, and I just said, oh my goodness, this is humbling, overwhelming, and it is God taking me through a lot of weeping and disappointment, and creating a sunrise and joy coming in the morning. And so it's just where just immediately I thought, this is what all the chaos that I thought my life has gone through, and the disappointment, God didn't waste any of that, and was preparing me to step into this role. And probably the greatest confirmation was it was still in my heart to eventually go back overseas and serve, because I have a gear that a fifth gear that kicks in when I'm overseas in another culture, and it's just not there in the States. But as I began to talk with Dr. Isla, I just had a tremendous peace that, I can do more for Lifeway in the US than what I could do for them if I came over here to Africa, because they're so effective. And they have such a huge base of inside leaders here that what Isla was looking for was an indigenous American to work with the American tribe and to be an inside leader in the US. And he said, Ken, I just don't understand you Americans. He said, I don't have time to do all the emails that you require and all the phone calls and documents. He said, I'm an oral person. I'm not real good at writing. But he said, God's called me to multiply African leaders, and that's what I'm going to do. And so I really need someone like you to help out. And so it is just, God's just given me this incredible peace and joy, and knowing this is where he's called me now. And I can serve this movement best where I am in Nashville. And so I resigned from the Church of the City effective January 31st, 2020. And if some of you know, and then this was the first time I was just going to be raising support and just trying to figure out, okay, how do I do this? I didn't have a clue. And I thought, well, I'll have plenty of time to have coffee with people. And then COVID happened. But God has been faithful in that. And so I continue to navigate this call. And as with any assignment, it requires a lot of faith, and it calls on us to not only draw from our gifting and our experience, but also to trust God in stepping into things. I have no clue what I'm doing, but I know he's called me to do it, and he'll provide. So now I'm going to shift. That's kind of a little bit of my story, but I want to just kind of go into details so you can kind of see this is a case study. This is what I do. This isn't what all or most movement servants would be doing, but in the particular assignment I have, so I'm the executive director of Lifeway Global US. They had already registered as a 501c3, but the board were just friends of Isla, and they weren't doing much of anything. And so I just had to start figuring it out with raising most of my support to cover office expenses, and then just recently, this past year, added a part-time assistant. So I could spend more time doing the things that really only I can do, and not some of the administrative stuff someone else could do just as well as I could. Working closely with the U.S. board, especially the executive team. We have board meetings quarterly, but I'm working more closely with the executive team every month. Coordinating teams of volunteers for the U.S. office. I've got about 10 volunteers that help in different areas. One of those would be prayer mobilization. And we're continuing to try and help with that. Grace Lucas is I think on this call in this group, and she's been a part of our prayer time and has been gracious in helping with some of that. And then several people in communications. I've got a finance team. Just one of the advantages of having been on a large church staff for almost 20 years is I have lots of relationships, a lot of people whose kids I've baptized or married, funerals I've done for families, have led lots of teams within the church, and then mission teams. And so just God has built an amazing group of people who I've gotten to know, who share a love for Christ and the Great Commission. So that's been just a real gift. And then partnership and resource development. Now that's working with foundations. Isla's introduced me to some, and then just in networking, I've contacted other foundations. We had one that was here just a week and a half ago, and I came the day before. 2 people from that foundation arrived and helped host them for 2 days here, and or we'll be doing follow-up with them in the States. So really, I'm very much connected with the office here, and Isla kind of directs people to me. And you know, I'm going to just say this. It's kind of interesting. Some people are disappointed when Isla says, well, talk to Ken, he's there in the U.S., because they want to just talk directly with Isla. They want the jazz of talking with the indigenous leader and spending time with them. It's a great story, and I understand that. But what I also understand is Isla isn't just wanting to be an indigenous organization. He's wanting to be a global mission organization and have multinational staff. And Western Church has kind of had the corner on the market in that arena. And I just love being kind of part of kind of a disruptor of sorts, of changing the narrative and changing the script on what God's doing in missions and how missions operate. Then foundations, also work with churches. We've now have 5 church partners who've come on with a 3 to 5 year commitment, and each of those churches have been partnered with a a unreached people group team. And so they're focusing on one unreached people group, and they'll be working with the team that is engaging that people group over the next 3 to 5 years. And so we're trying to be strategic. We don't encourage people to come over here just if they're looking to come one time and just see what's happening. We're talking with people who really want to be strategic in engaging with us. And so I help with overseeing that. And then mission organization, we have several mission organizations who are partnering with us. The Evangelical Free Church of America is a strong partner with us right now. And there's some other churches that we work with in denominations. And then individuals, a number of individuals that I communicate with. And then when Dr. Isla comes over, I set up his calendar. We talk about kind of where we're going to go with our partners, who we're going to visit. And then I typically accompany him so he can easily pass off those relationships so that I'm the primary contact in those. And then my role in Africa, I'm considered staff with the Nairobi team. And I serve on the Lifeway Global core team. There's 7 of us that serve on the core team. I serve with the online training team, and I'm here in Nairobi at least 3 times a year for 1 to 2 weeks. And then I also, Isla has insisted, he had a guy, Dave Hunt, you may know that name. He got to be good friends with Isla early in Isla's ministry, and they've remained friends. And Isla said, I see God giving you and Christian a similar kind of relationship. And I want part of what you do is to just serve alongside Christian in that whatever capacity, but as an outside leader, as Christian's an inside leader. And so we do weekly phone calls. I'm in Malawi at least 3 times a year for a week. So I piggyback my times here. And 1 week I'm in Malawi and coordinate a small U.S. team focused on the Malawi movement. So that's it. There you go. So questions? Chris, is that kind of what you were looking for?
Yeah, and that's perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. If you guys have questions, definitely post them in the chat, and I'll go through some of those. Ken, I've got a couple I'll ask you while others are submitting theirs. I'm curious what you would think Dr. Isla would say about the value of movement servants. So I know you've served in that movement, and I know probably there's other people that are helping him. As a movement leader, describe how you think he would respond to the question, are movement servants helpful, and in what ways are they helpful?
Oh, yeah. Well, I kind of alluded to it. Isla said, God's called me to multiply African leaders and to catalyze disciple-making movements among the unreached. And within that, doing that, he has these global partnerships, and there's a lot to maintaining those. And it was a real burden to him and a real weight, and held him down because that's not what he's gifted with. And I think that's where God began to say, you need to release some of this to others as well. And so yeah, there's a Shanta Dawson. She's part of the Lifeway Global medical team. She's a nurse in the U.S., and so she helps coordinate all of those. There's a guy in Germany who is kind of emerging in a similar role as mine, but in Europe. So because Isla's connecting with a number of churches and organizations in Europe right now. So I definitely think, and if anything, Isla's a visionary. He's about 10 years ahead. So I'm sure in his mind, he can think of a number of ways movement servants can come alongside Lifeway Global.
That's great, Ken. Let me ask one more, and then there's a few in the chat I'll ask you. Um, what would you say to somebody that maybe be somebody on this call that would express interest in becoming a movement servant, but they're not sure they have a skill set or abilities that would be helpful to movements? Maybe they say, well, I don't know if I could be a U.S. director like Ken, but I could do something else. What would you say to somebody that thinks, hey, this is great, I don't know if I have anything that would be helpful to somebody like Isla?
Yeah, I would start with saying, look at what's in your hands. I mean, God is already giving us what we need for what He has for us to do. And so look at your story and then look for ways to intersect with movement leaders and just begin to get to know them. I mean, that's kind of what happened when I came to Catalyst Camp. I had no idea, but God just, there were people there. I started having conversations, and one thing led to another. And it was not me looking for this. It was God opening the door. And so I just think, take the next step. I mean, we all know about obedience, just kind of being obedient with the next thing, and then waiting for the Spirit to reveal what then the next step would be.
That's great, Ken. Hey, Tim had the question about, you were talking about some of the disappointment you had leading up to Lifeway. I think you talked about, he mentioned some weeping and disappointment. He asks, was some of that weeping and disappointment after you said yes to Lifeway, or I guess was that before? And then are you married? And
Oh, no.
if
That's
so, how
when,
did that conversation go with your wife of changing from a church environment to what you're doing now?
yeah. No, that the weeping came after in college. I understood. In fact, it was Stan Park's dad through his preaching that God made just a very clear call to cross-cultural missions. And so, yeah, when our first child was born, and that just to give that up, it was just a free fall. And then when we were finally made it overseas, and then 4 years later, the rug's pulled out from under us, it seemed like a bait and switch that God had pulled on us. And so there was just a lot of anger again I had to work through, and disappointment, and just trust. I never completely resolved it, other than God, where else can I go? You alone have the words of life. And I'm going to trust you, even though I don't understand this, because if I leave you, I'd have no place to go. And and I didn't have a right to that, and I was just willing to continue to serve as best I could. But then, I still feel incredibly humbled and overwhelmed, being in something I would never have even dreamed to be a part of. But that's what I love about being older, is the perspective, looking back and just seeing the faithfulness of God, even when for years it was hard for me to see that at the time.
Hey, Ken, John's asking, what is the Catalyst camp that you were talking about?
Okay. This will be the 10th year, and it's a gathering. It started very small and it was closed. And then I think it was Roy Moran who came one time. Isla invited him as a speaker, and he said to Isla, you ought to open this up to other people. This is rich. And to have practitioners coming, sharing best practices and networking, getting to know each other. And so he started opening it up. But it's 4 days here in Nairobi. And last year there were 260 people from 47 countries who came, and who all have a heart for movement. And we're learning from each other, networking, starting collaborations, and celebrating what God's doing all over the world, and just celebrating that we're part of something bigger, and it's getting bigger every year.
Ken Roy has told me before that it's one of the best places in his mind for rubbing shoulders with movement catalysts and
Yeah.
folks that are active movement practitioners. He just said it's a great environment to be in. There was one you guys was online a couple of years ago, Ken, I think because of COVID. I think most of the others have been in person, but
Yeah, we did it 2 years online.
2 years. Okay, yeah. So yeah, it's really awesome. John's asking, when does that take place, Ken?
It's the second week in June every year.
Hmm.
I think it's like the 13th through the 17th, something like that. It's a Tuesday through a Friday. So most people arrive on Monday because we start Tuesday morning and then it goes to Friday afternoon. And it's kind of a loose schedule, and that's done intentionally. You've got 3 meals to sit down and talk with people, and 2 tea times, a morning tea time and an afternoon tea time. So just communicating, networking, talking with people, getting to know people is a huge part of what it's for. And then we do case studies and then breakout trainings, different modules that people can go to.
Ken, Bob is asking, do you interface with any African nationals from Kenya or Malawi in the US?
Okay, what was the first part of that?
He said, do you interface with any African nationals from Kenya or Malawi located in the US, or just the ones that are in Africa?
Right now, not really. I mean, Isla knows has a whole network there that's just more personal. He's gone to several African churches when he's in the US and done some training. So I guess in that regard, Isla has been doing some of that based off of his own relationships and network.
And last question I'd like to ask you is just, is there anything else that you can think of that could be helpful to share with this group from your experience as we're considering how the Lord might use us as movement servants? So we're recognizing, as you know from the series, if 90% of movements are started by other movements, man, if I have any skill set or ability or something that could be helpful in addition to what I'm doing, I want to help movements. Anything else you could share that would just encourage us to
Yeah,
be
totally.
looking into seeing in what ways we could help these movements that are out there that are starting
Yeah,
with them.
yeah. And Chris, one of the things I failed to mention, I had my notes overlooked it when I was talking about it, but one of your sessions was on Barnabas. And we looked at all these passages about Barnabas. And God used that to begin kind of stirring in me as I was thinking about this connection with missions. And, a lot of people have skills. Isla wasn't just looking for someone with skills. And I don't think, rarely does he do that. He's looking for character, for faithfulness, for a heart for God, and a love for the lost. And he knows he can develop skills. And as Westerners, we bring lots of baggage with us when we're working with most any non-Western leader. There's a lot of history that's tied to us. And so this whole concept of movement leader, humility, deferring to uh, our indigenous leaders, the inside leaders, uh, lifting them up, uh, being Barnabases to them. That is at the heart of what a movement servant is. And so much of it is more about character and heart than it is about what skills you have. So I would just say that. So if you're not thinking you have many skills, but just what is God stirring in your heart? I mean, is this something that you're starting to lose sleep about and just keep coming back to? Just be open to what God might do. And as with me, timing has never been what I thought it would be. So don't get easily discouraged if it doesn't happen, next month or next year or 5 years from now. Just, Mary pondered a lot of things in her heart. And so for some of you, it may be a lot of pondering this in your hearts before God gives you that assignment.
Ken, I think that's such a great word. And one thing that Stan has told me before, and you could probably testify to this as well, is sometimes if you were to ask a movement, if I could serve in any way, if I could help in any way, what would it be? So often, what they consider most valuable is you mobilizing prayer for them. Not just you praying for them, but mobilizing people to pray for them. And Ken, as you were saying, you don't have to have a certain degree, college. You just have to love Jesus and think, man, what they're doing is really important. And if they're saying the best way I can help is by mobilizing prayer, sign me up. Whatever you need, I'll do. And so much of it, like you said, has to do with just being on fire for the Lord and being willing to do whatever it's going to take. So, Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you guys help me give him a round of applause for coming and hanging out with us? It was great. Ken, thank you for staying up late. I know it's almost midnight now, your time. So we really enjoyed having you today. Thank you, brother.
Okay.
We'll have you back
Thank
again
you.
soon. God bless.
Thank you, guys. Blessings.